Executive Outcomes were a private military and security company. They were formed in the wake of the apartheid regime in southern Africa. They are most known for operating in Angola and Sierra Leone. They are also heavily linked to the incident known as the Sandline Affair. This is an interesting period of history, as due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, you saw a lack of structured military support for the quote-unquote third world developing nations. The conflict is often overlooked prior by the Cold War and later by the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan by the coalition forces, predominantly the United States and the United Kingdom. Executive Outcomes are known for revolutionising the private security sector. They are largely unknown due to the proximity to the former apartheid regime and the general consensus against the use of private military forces. The important geopolitical context is that the collapse of the Union sought many third world developing countries to seek out their own means of defence. During this period, we saw the downscaling of the US military, with less emphasis on combating the threat of communism. A combined lack of funding and lack of training saw many developing African nations turn to the private sector, at first for training, but then to seek open combat against enemy combatants. Prior to the collapse of the apartheid regime, South African Defence Forces engaged in several bloody border wars. They gained expertise in bushfighting and developed a unique military doctrine for fighting on the African continent. The new government, led by the African National Congress, sought to disband many of these highly specialised police and military units. This was in part due to many of these special units being used to combat the African National Congress, who were deemed a terrorist organisation prior to the collapse of the apartheid regime. The subsequent mass unemployment of a highly specialised force saw the private sector capitalise on a new, highly developed, highly specialised combat force. Eben Barlow and Michael Mullen, former members of the Civil Cooperation Bureau, established Executive Outcomes in 1989. The group initially focused on special forces training to select security officers throughout the African continent. Other key personnel were Simon Mann and Tony Buckingham. Simon Mann was a former member of the British SAS, and Tony Buckingham had significant interests in the oil and gas sector. Executive Outcomes initially sought to train the Angolan armed forces. However, this soon escalated into direct conflict against the UNITA rebels, who had failed to recognise a democratic election in 1992. Executive Outcomes proved to be effective, and they forced UNITA to the negotiating table. However, due to pressure from the United Nations and the United States, the Angolan armed forces terminated their contract with Executive Outcomes. Executive Outcomes were replaced by a UN peacekeeping force. However, they proved to be ineffective and conflict remained shortly thereafter. The success in Angola drew the attention of the government of Sierra Leone, who were battling a group known as the Revolutionary United Front. This conflict is depicted in the popular movie Blood Diamond, in which Leonardo DiCaprio plays a former Southern African Special Forces soldier who then turns to a private military organisation depicted closely to Executive Outcomes. The conflict focused heavily around a diamond mine, hence the name Blood Diamond. Executive Outcomes were unique in that they were able to deploy a battalion-sized troop of soldiers alongside highly specialised equipment, notably the Russian Hind helicopter, 2 troop-carrying helicopters, an armoured personnel carrier, and a Russian main battle tank. Executive Outcomes also had close ties to Ibis Air, who were a private military organisation focusing on aviation. Ibis Air were able to deploy a small fleet of fighter aircraft, alongside several aircraft provided by the Angolan Air Force. Executive Outcomes sought to advise the government of South Africa on the regulation of private military forces. The bill sought to prohibit direct participation of private military forces in an armed conflict. It is unclear why Executive Outcomes ceased to operate after 1998. However, it is likely that international pressure and internal conflicts within the organisation sought the group to formally disband its services and focus, with many of its members moving into different organisations focusing primarily on training throughout many different private military organisations. To learn more about the Sandline Affair, please subscribe.